It's time for a Young Heretics pop quiz. Ready? What is special about the following sentence? Her husband was weak, ugly, and awkward, so she dangled him in a bag and bashed him until he died. Now, if you answered that this sentence is special because of the exciting prospect of wish fulfillment that it describes, you need to seek help. But there is something special and important about this sentence that matters a lot for our journey into the past that we are now making into the history of the English language. And that is, in this sentence, if I'm not mistaken, every verb and noun comes from Old Norse, which is the language of the Vikings. This is Viking Visibility Week on Young Heretics. We did not talk about Old Norse and its influence on English last time when I gave you my broad strokes history of the English language. But husband, weak, ugly, awkward, dangle, bag, bash, and die are all Old Norse words. And Old Norse is a Germanic language. It's a stage in the evolution of the Germanic languages as they become Scandinavian, because that's what the Vikings were. They were Scandinavian marauders, journeymen, invaders, however you want to describe them. And England is one of the places they invaded in, for example, the late 700s and so on. And the words that they brought to England made their way into certainly modern English, definitely Middle English. They show up a lot in Middle English, but probably they also made their way into Old English, although we don't have as many texts in Old English that demonstrate the adoption of these words into Old English, but they probably entered into the vocabulary, into the language, and then gradually made their way into the written text, because it's not as if these words are very likely to show up on official documentation. They clearly come from a context of invasion. They come from people coming in, Vikings coming in, raping and pillaging, and leaving behind their language to describe all the nasty bad things they were doing, all the nasty ways they regarded the English. And sometimes it's not that there were only conflicts between the Vikings and the English. There were some sort of more peaceful interactions that seem to have given us some Old Norse words as well. But this is an extra ingredient to think about, but it doesn't add. The reason I didn't talk about it last time is because I was giving you a survey, and because Old Norse doesn't add a fundamentally new etymological ingredient into the English language. It doesn't, first of all, affect the deep structure in the sense that, French becomes actually integrated into the language and changes the verb forms and so forth. And it brings in a new stream of etymological history. It brings in Latin via French, whereas Old Norse is from the same stream as Anglo-Saxon. They're both from this Germanic family tree, even though they're starting to branch out. They're recognizably related. And so you have basically just a kind of like cousin marriage going on here. And this illustrates another interesting and awesome feature of the English language, and that is our relationship to what are called loanwords. They're called loanwords because they're words that get loaned out from another language, although so far as I know, we've never given any of ours back, so I'm not sure why they're called loanwords and not just purchase words or received words. But loanwords is a fun phrase, and it just means anything that you take from another language. All languages do this to some extent. When you have cultural contact, you're going to have linguistic contact. I talked last week about how weird it is there aren't more Celtic words in English, given how much contact the Saxons and the Angles had with the Celts. But basically from then on, if the Anglo-Saxons encounter a culture, they're going to filch a couple words. They're going to nab a couple words from that culture and that language. Old Norse is one of the classic examples, but they're all over. I mean, they're certainly there's a lot of Latin words that we pick up. And one of the cool things about English that we tend to do that not all languages do, and certainly most languages don't do to the extent that we do, when we pick up a word from another language, we don't just import the root form of the word, the dictionary form of the word, and then start to use it the way we would use an English word with English grammar. We actually import the grammar of the word too a lot of the time, and what's called the word's morphology, which is the way that it can change depending on its use in a sentence. So the most easy way to talk about morphology from our daily experiences with plurals, right? When you have one thing the word looks one way, and then when you have multiple things, the word looks different. And in many cases, in English, you will add an S or an ES. Thing becomes things, chair becomes chairs. But also we have all sorts of other ways of making words into plural. And we tend to take words from other languages and then make them plural in the same way as the other language makes them plural. And there's a great example of this in our Latin words when we take a neuter form Latin word that ends in um. If you ever see a word in English that ends in um, good chance it comes from a Latin neuter gender word that is neither masculine nor feminine. And the plural of a Latin word ending in um is not ums, but a. The um turns into a. And an example of how this can sometimes work is the word agenda, which is actually a plural word that we use in a singular sense. We have the agenda for a meeting. But deep in the history of that language, what that really is the things that must be done in that meeting. Because one agendum in Latin is one thing that must be done. And so the plural of agendum is agenda. This is also why the plural of criterion is not criterions, but criteria, and why criteria is not a singular. You'll often hear people say, my one criteria for a good whiskey is this, and that is maddening once you know that it's actually from Greek that the word criterion comes, but they have a similar thing with on is their neuter ending, and that becomes a. And so criterion is our singular, and criteria is our plural. And once you see this, smart people get this wrong all the time, and it will drive you bananas. And it's considered very impolite to tell somebody that they've gotten it wrong. And I have to admit that even for me, it's incredibly annoying when somebody corrects your grammar mid-flow. This is why proofreaders are important, but in your daily life, all you can really do is sit and fume and be annoyed. So you're welcome. I've now introduced a new way into your life for you to get annoyed and not really be able to do anything about it, but knowledge is really fun. This is why also the word media is plural. And as you can tell, these kinds of words do start to decay over time, and we kind of begin gradually, like the trees and roots growing over the ruin of an old building. English does start to swallow up these loan words and use them in the normal way, which is why even I have started to not feel so bad when people say the news media is really getting annoying about this, is because we've basically now just swallowed that word up. But for a long time, we kept that plural, which is kind of cool. And we do this in all sorts of other ways. Like when we get words from, or phrases from Asian languages, we'll often retain the grammatical structure of the sentence in the Asian language, which is totally different. So in Chinese, for example, they say "hao zhou bu zhen," which I'm totally butchering because I don't really know Chinese tones, but "hao zhou bu zhen" means long time no see. And that's why we say long time no see instead of long time not seen, which would be much more natural in English, but there aren't those sorts of past participles and past tense formations in Chinese. And so we've just lifted that right on up and stuck it into English. And you can start to see this everywhere, all over the English language. My personal favorite one, although this is really a lost cause, and you're going to hate me for telling you about this. The plural of octopus isn't octopi, it's octopuses. And here's why. The US ending in English is a great example of one of these endings that comes from Latin into English and then retains often its Latin plural. And the plural of US as a masculine nominative singular ending in Latin is I. When you make it plural, it becomes I. So syllabus, the plural of syllabus is syllabi, right? And there's a bunch of different examples of this. And so octopus looks like one of those words. But, do not be fooled. As a matter of fact, octopus comes to us from Greek in a much more irregular way, and that is the octopus is the thing that has 8 feet, right? So octo means 8 in Greek, and pous means foot, but us in Greek is not the masculine singular ending. Os is the masculine singular ending, and it becomes oi, oi, whereas pous is a third declension noun, and the plural of pous, foot, is podes, feet. And so the most natural way to pluralize octopus in English would actually be octopodes, but octopuses is our natural sort of analog for that. And if you can mount a campaign to restore that plural to its rightful place in the English language, God bless you, but I so far have been unsuccessful. Anyway, though, it's nice to know about these things, and it's cool to see them kind of enter into English and morph, and it's going on from very early on in the English language, not only with the acquisition of Norse, but with the kind of preview of the Latin language that we get before the Norman conquest. So I said last week that the Norman conquest, 1066, right, you get this imposition of Latin via French, and it really does meld with the language and turn it into a new language. Now, Norse doesn't do that, as I've just said, and neither does Latin until French comes up on the scene, but we do have many encounters with the Latin language, and that is, for example, through not only the Roman past of Britain, but on into the future through the Christianization of England. And that happens through what's called the Gregorian mission in 569 AD, and it's named for Pope Gregory the Great, who really was, I have to say, pretty great. I mean, a lot of people get the Great and as part of their title, and you're like, how great? I mean, Alexander was a great leader. Was he really a great guy? I don't know. Gregory the Great was pretty cool, and there's a lot to say about him. But one thing to say is that there's a story. Gregory the Great, before he was pope, was in the Roman marketplace, encountered some blonde boys. And blonde people, in general, were very unusual. And these boys really looked different. And we're not sure a different version of the story. They may have been slaves. They might have just been hanging around. Either way, he finds them, and he's like, whoa, what is going on? Like, this is really crazy. Who are you? Where you come from? And they say, we come from a people called the Angles. And he starts to make all of these really bad puns about how Angle sounds like angel. And so obviously these people are destined to become Christians. And he asks the boys, are your people Christians, or are you still caught up in the errors of the pagans? And the boys say, no, they're still pagans. And this is when Gregory gets it into his head that he really, really, really wants to. He has a heart for, as we might say, the English people. And he wants himself to go on a mission because Gregory, he's sort of a Cincinnatus figure. He's like the guy that really, really, really doesn't want to be pope. He wants to be a monk is what he really wants to be. Very ascetic, very private, very scholarly, and really into like charity and alms and all this stuff. And so he, at the time, not being pope, says, I know what I'll do. I'll go off on this expedition and I will Christianize the English peoples and turn the Angles into angels. But turns out he's already, at the time, too important to figure in Rome. He's on his way when he gets recalled because the people love him too much, and there's like important stuff going on with the Lombards and just crises and stuff at this time. He can't go. He's really bummed out about this, just gutted that he can't go to England. But once he's pope, nobody can stop him from sending a mission, which he does in the person of Augustine of Canterbury. Not Augustine, our bro, that we know from many episodes of the show, who writes the Confessions and so forth, but this other guy, Augustine of Canterbury, who does bring Christianity to England in 569, and from then on you start to get an emerging Latin literature among the scholarly classes of the English people, because now they have basically a priestly caste. And for example, Bede, who is best known for really establishing the AD BC dating system. He lives from 672 to 735, and he writes in Latin. And so this is why we don't see an immediate just total takeover of Latinate words into English, is because it is still pretty rarefied, elite, select, scholarly. And it's also why the Latin influence from the church, which is using Latin, doesn't have a different, really, effect than the Latin influence from the French. It's just the French have a bigger effect, but they have the same kind of effect because these are both upper-class phenomena. And so we're still going to get very elevated and kind of fancy words out of our Latin influences. But these are two sort of smaller little points that we can fill in to fill out our picture of the development of English. And all of this becomes important as we start to think about the stew that is Middle English. So last time I said that we were going, in order to really learn how to read Middle English and Old English literature without going through a whole class on it and trying to become fluent in it, which I am not fluent in Old English or in Middle English. I'm decent at Old English. I'm decent at Middle English, but really as an amateur, it's not my area of expertise. And I think it can be really helpful obviously I like to talk to you about stuff that I know a lot about, but I also think it can be really helpful for somebody that does read a lot to kind of talk you through how to dip your toe into something. So that's what I'm doing with you on this series. And as I said last week, I'm going to move backward in time. And the reason for that is this theory that I got from Martin West, the Oxford Don, about the climbing wall, that when you want to know something new, you should start from what you know best and then work your way to the thing you know just a little bit less and learn about that. And then from there, you learn something that is further away and so forth. And what we know best in this context is modern English. We all know how to speak modern English, or you couldn't understand what I'm saying to you right now. So I'm taking it for granted that you are a pretty decent user, reader, speaker, writer of modern English. And I started last week with Thomas Malory and the Mort d'Arthur. And I showed you how by learning how to pronounce this stuff, you can kind of stumble your way through reading it out loud. And again, I'm no expert. I didn't do an expert job last week of reading Old English or Middle English. You don't have to understand and get some of the flavor of what this stuff is. And so Malory comes from Caxton's printing press. I don't know if you remember, I talked about William Caxton, who brought the printing press to England and was a very important figure in the history of English letters. And that comes out in 1485, the edition of Malory's Mort d'Arthur. And I read to you from a modern edition that nevertheless has the old or the Middle English version in it. And you could start to see how when you hear it out loud, it's not as crazy or as difficult as it might be otherwise to get to know this text and feel some of the flavor of it. And then you can read through it on your own time after you've sort of heard how it's supposed to sound or how close it sounds when you read it aloud to modern English. And so now we're going to take yet another step further and go back to one of my favorite works of medieval literature, and that is Gawain and the Green Knight by an anonymous poet. We don't know who wrote it, but from around the turn of the 15th century. So we're going back from 1485, just a hop, skip, and a jump over to around 1400, or maybe slightly earlier. And this is a poem that we have from one manuscript. It's called the Pearl Manuscript, and it's in the Northwest Midlands dialect of Middle English. So we are starting to venture into territory unseen. We're going to be dealing with some weird sounding words and weird looking words. And it's at this juncture that I would recommend to you, if you are interested in going on this adventure with me at home, following along at home, it's at this juncture that I would recommend to you a facing page translation. That is an edition which prints a modern English version on one page, and then on the other page prints the original manuscript version of the Middle English, because we really are in a different language now, and we've moved beyond the thing that I talked about last week, where in modern English, a lot of things get standardized and a lot of forms change that become, it's called Chancery English. It's a particular form of English that basically becomes established in the modern period. We're before that now, and so one thing you have to contend with is that all the vowels are a little bit different. And so you have to, when you're reading it aloud, you can't really pronounce the vowels the way that you would, and that makes it sound very different. And the read aloud strategy still helps, but is a little bit less helpful, and you do need a reference if you're not going to go away and learn the whole language. You do need a reference to try to connect what you see on the left side of the page with what you would say in the modern world. And so the vowels shift, that's the main thing. There are, luckily, very good facing page editions of a lot of these classic works of Middle English literature. And I guess that's because English readers typically want to see what the older English looks like, and it is fun to check it out, and it can help you to get a grasp on what we're all about here, which is understanding how your language works better. Because it's not just of antiquarian interest or scholarly interest, it's all about getting a handle on the tool that you use every day to do almost everything, to communicate, to get what you want, to persuade, to work. Probably your work involves words, I would imagine, and effectively wielding that tool is really important. Understanding the nuts and bolts of it's really important, and learning about its history is one way to do that. So what I want to do now is read with you some of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And this is kind of a different strain, a different part of the tradition of King Arthur literature than I read to you last time. Last time I read to you Malory, which is part of the Chronicles. And the Chronicles are these prose narratives, these stories that have the form of history. And really, it's out of this that the English historiographical tradition is going to emerge. Obviously, the standards of it are going to change to conform more with both the classical ideal from Herodotus and Thucydides, but also with the modern idea of fact versus fiction. And so you're not going to get Arthur in modern English histories except as a legend. But this prose style is kind of about history. It represents itself as this historical style. But you also get poetry about the same stories. And you should think of the Arthur stories, the Arthur legends, as like a big grab bag, like a variety show of different episodes that you can pick out at any time. And there are stock characters. Arthur is always a certain way. Merlin's always a certain way. There are certain facts and points of history that always kind of exist. And those are like the primary colors of any Arthurian story you're going to tell, but you can take those elements and arrange them however you want. Or think of them like building blocks, right? If you're building a castle, you might have like the big yellow triangle and the little red cylinder and the blue square cube, but you're going to build a bunch of different castles out of that. And that's kind of how these artists work, and you can do some very sophisticated, beautiful stuff with it. And in poetry, it's almost like if you took kids' building blocks and you made them into some vast sculpture like in Minecraft or something. That's what some of these poems are like. They're genuine works of art using these sort of rudimentary ideas that then get changed and edited and slightly altered, and it's fun to see what is original to each work and what is kind of part of the repertoire of the Arthurian stories. So Gawain is a character that we meet many times in Mallory and in the other chronicles, and he does have some very distinctive features that we always expect him to have. One of them is that he's young. He's often, I'm not sure if he always is, but he's often King Arthur's nephew, but he's always young. And that's important because usually in, for example, the Mallory stories, he has to become a knight. He's not a knight that already has his own little domain and fiefdom, but then joins up with Arthur's larger clan and adds his powers to the Power Rangers. He's somebody that has to get his powers, get his knighthood from this new guild that Arthur is forming. And he's a junior partner, therefore, in the corporation. And he also has to prove himself, and he often fails. He'll often fail quite spectacularly in ways having to do with his sex drive, his libido. Like he'll sleep with some woman, or he'll tell a guy that he's not going to sleep with his wife, and then he does sleep with his wife. And that means that another important feature of Gawain's story is repentance. There's always a moment when Gawain has to own up to his mistake, learn, and then grow out of that. So he's a very endearing character in that way, and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a big exploration of those themes, along with kind of a certain type of story that you do frequently get, which is the quest story that comes out of an exchange of gifts, or sometimes there's also the beheading game, which is part of this. The story is that you get King Arthur is at table, at feast, and this is a thing that one of the tropes about him, one of the repeated things that occurs, is that Arthur won't feast until something marvelous happens. And that's what he wishes for before he starts to eat. And this is a way of setting off what usually ends up being a year-long adventure, because you'll have somebody come in and you'll have the thing that Arthur hoped for, some marvelous adventure or strange mystery occurs, and then when that feast comes back around the next year, like if it's Pentecost or if it's Christmas or whatever, when that feast comes back around, then the conclusion of the story happens. And that's what happens here in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It is kind of a Christmas poem because the inciting incident happens at Christmas, and it's this big green knight who comes in and says, you can strike any blow to me, anyone in your company can strike any blow to me he wants, and the only thing is that next year on this same feast, I get to strike the same blow. And Gawain volunteers because he's the hot-headed young knight, and he cuts the Green Knight's head off, and everybody thinks, well, that's sorted, except then the Green Knight picks up his head, walks out, and says, see you in a year. And the whole thing is just the quest from then on. It's really great fun. Well worth reading. Highly recommend reading it. And I would recommend this edition by Simon Armitage called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It is a facing page edition. Simon Armitage is one of these translator poets who's less an expert in language than he is in the use of the modern language. And so this is a very beautiful but also powerful and kind of modern charged version of the poem. And there's another one that I would also endorse for you, which is J.R.R. Tolkien's version. I'm going to read you both translations of a small little section, a very famous part of this poem, so that you can sense both the original and what it's like to have the original with you, but also how different translations kind of make use of the original to bring the poem alive into English. And hopefully that will be helpful as we make our journey back through the older forms and the weirder forms of Middle English. This passage is, well, first of all, the poem itself is in alliterative verse, which means that rather than rhymes, and rather even than rhythm, although there is a rhythm to the verses, the main defining feature of the verse is alliteration, which is not something we think about. We almost think of alliteration as kind of corny now. But in these days, alliteration was one of the most exciting features of the English language, and it does have, when you get into it, a real beauty. It's sort of a rustic beauty, actually, and it's preserved in this translation as well as in Tolkien's translation, that each line has one letter that repeats 4 times. And in fact, there are 4 stressed syllables that come up again and again. And then you have what's called the bob and wheel at the end of each stanza. So you have these longer lines, long narrative stretches, and then the bob and wheel kind of sums things up, and the bob is a little tiny line and the wheel is 3 other lines, or 4 other lines rather, and those do rhyme. So I'm going to read to you a little bit of this as we go, but I'm also going to just show you how somebody who is in no way an expert can start to, puzzle his way through some of these words, and how you might go further in that adventure if you chose. As I said, this is a facing page edition, but it does not have a pronunciation guide at the beginning. So for that, YouTube and Google are your friends. This is one of the places where good internet is good. I'm going to drop some links. The Folger Library has some great guides on how to read Middle English. So does Harvard. There are also some videos online. Arthuriana.com is really fun for its recordings. But basically, what you have to get a handle on is the different pronunciations of the vowels. For example, the letter Y and the letter I as well are both pronounced like in the word beat, for instance. So when you say min seat, that's mine sight, right? And similarly, you might not initially know that the letter A or double A is pronounced like O in bog. So instead of mate, you would say moat. And that sometimes has an important effect for the meaning, because mate and moat obviously are very different words. Here's a passage from Gawain that's very, very famous because of the artistry of its description, and it is the passing of the year. It's sort of like a time-lapse interval, because we have some adventures that happen to Gawain right after the coming of the night. But then, basically, we fast forward to when he has to go and face the night again, and the poet describes the turning of the entire year, season by season, with very, very beautiful imagery. I'm not going to read the whole thing. We don't have time, but there is just this part alone, which is part of Fit 2, the second part of the poem. And at the beginning of Fit 2, we get the transition into the future that ends with this bob and wheel idea. And I'll read it first in Armitage's modern English. The conclusion of this is, "At Michaelmas the moon stands like that season's sign, a warning to Gawain to rouse himself and ride." So that's the bob and wheel, that little conclusion, but Michaelmas is the end of the year, and so now we know that we've reached the end. But before that, we've had the turning of the seasons, and there's one 4-line passage that I want to read just so that we can get a feel for this, and that is when autumn comes. And here's how Armitage renders it. He says, "Autumn arrives to harden the harvest, and with it comes a warning to ripen before winter." So with, warning, winter, these repeated consonants at the beginning of words, that's the alliteration. "With it comes a warning to ripen before winter. The drying airs arrive, driving up dust from the face of the earth to the heights of heaven, and wild sky wrestles the sun with its winds, and the leaves of the lime lay littered on the ground, and grass that was green turns withered and gray." I had to go on a little bit because it's so much fun, that loping 4-stress line with the alliterative sound. But here's some of that in Middle English. And again, I want to emphasize, I'm going to make mistakes here, and you will make mistakes when you read too, but I have a basic idea of how this stuff works that I've gotten from reading online, and that helps me to take a look at the original. And then if I want somebody really reading it well, I can go to YouTube and Arthuriana.com and so forth. But here we go. Let's see what we can find as we explore some of the Middle English that Armitage has just rendered. This is about autumn, right? "Bot then hies harvest, and hardenes him sona, warnes him for the winter to wax full ripe. He dreves with drought the dust for to rease, fro the face of the folde to flee full hie. Roth the winde of the welkin rastelis with the sunne, the levis lauken for the linde and leiten on the grounde, and all greyes the grace that graine was era. So you see how it starts to take on a sort of Highlands or even Irish lilt to it. And again, you can go listen to experts do this online, but you can yourself do it at home a little bit and start to get into it. And as you get more and more into it, you'll get better and better. And you can start to feel the sound of the poetry, and you can see some interesting things. Like, remember last week I talked to you about how Queen Igraine waxed greater and greater. She got bigger and bigger. She got more and more pregnant. Well, now I notice that here's that word wax again. Warnes him for the winter to wax full... warns him for the winter to wax a full reaper, warns the autumn for the winter to wax full ripe. And actually, if you look close at this, you can really recognize the English of it. You need the modern English to check yourself against, but here's the bob and wheel, right? Till Megalmes Mona was cumen with winter waga, then thankis Gawain fulsona of his Annius Viaga. Till Megalmes, right? At Michaelmas, the moon was come with winter waga, with winter's wages. So there's something like with what sort of the signs of winter are coming, right? And Armitage gives us stands like that season sign. Then thinks Gawain full zona of his anxious Viaga, thinks of full soon about his coming voyage, or his... I think this is related to anxious, although I didn't actually check that one before I logged on here. But you see how you can do this and kind of raise up different questions. And for me, what I have been most fascinated by is this word wax, which I've been tracing throughout different passages, because it actually is, and we're going to get to this next week, it's an Old English word, and it takes on a bunch of different meanings, all of which have to do with the kind of gradual increase, almost like you're layering wax onto something. But here earlier we had a woman pregnant who was waxing. Now we have the waxing of the harvest. It's time to wax the harvest, because if it doesn't wax now, it will get killed by the winter. And you can see that word starting to branch out through all of its different meanings. And we're going to come eventually to a point in Old English where it is at the very root of its meaning, at the very beginning of just growing. And you see all the different ways that it can come to mean growing physically, growing visually, even growing in a more abstract, like you can wax poetical, you can become poetic. This is just a taste of how that works. I want to read to you also that same passage in Tolkien's translation, so that you can feel some of the differences and know what you're getting into if you want to go away and read this poem. When harvest hurries in and hardens it quickly, warns it before winter to wax to ripeness, warns it before winter to wax to ripeness. So I think Tolkien gets a little bit more of the kind of galloping feel than Armitage does. Both get it, and they both get the alliteration. But Tolkien is more archaic, and he purposefully uses archaic words even for his own time, as we'll see in just a second. He drives with his drought the dust till it rises from the face of the land and flies up aloft. Wild wind in the welkin makes war on the sun. The leaves loosed from the linden alight on the ground, and all grey as the grass that green was before. So green was before, and Tolkien had a feel and a taste for these archaic phrases, these archaic ways of speaking that comes out, for example, in Lord of the Rings, but also here. And the word welkin, which just means sky, and is also an Old English word, fits here because we do want some of that kind of stately, archaic sound, but might be harder to read. And Armitage's is more immediate, more up to date, which also has value to it. One way of getting a poem alive in the modern day is to try to think of what somebody writing it now would say, what the modern analogs for all the ideas are. But another way is to do what Tolkien has done here and kind of drape the whole thing with a certain feeling of oldness. And with the Middle English next to you, even if, like me, you're not an expert, and with these different translations, you can start to get a real good sense, I think, for how this literature works and how the spirit of this Arthurian adventure comes through in really one of the great poems of the English language. So go check out Gawain. Hope this is fun. We're going to keep going back in time next week, and I will see you then for more Truth beauty and the stuff that matters.